Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of Gaudium at Spes22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I have a repeat guest on the show today, someone I greatly enjoy talking to due to his great knowledge of theology, and that is former professor at Sacred Heart Seminary, which is in Detroit, Dr. Eduardo Echeverria, who I think has written about 800 books. And how you do it, I don't know. Welcome to the show, Eduardo.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be here to talk about, issues related to the contemporary state of the church. Um, yeah, today we're going to talk about the second edition of my Pope Francis book.
Yeah,
Pope
called Pope
Francis,
Francis, The Legacy of Vatican II, first
that's
came out
right.
in 2019.
That's
There it
right.
is. There it is. Yeah. You know
So the
what?
way it lo-
I have the book, and normally I hold it up for my guests to see, listen to it, Pope Francis, The Legacy of Vatican II. But we're in the midst of trying to sell the farm, and I've got so many of my books packed up already.
right.
I think I looked desperately amongst the books that aren't packed for that book, and I couldn't find it. So it must be
No worries, man. No
buried somewhere.
worries.
So anyway, I did read the book. It's been a while though. And that's why I was trying to find the book. It was to look at my notes and my underlinings, but I couldn't do it. So I'm a bit of disadvantage today. So why don't you walk us through it? Well, first, I mean, what made you write? You first wrote it in 2019.
Well, I
So
actually
why did you
wrote
write
a
it?
I wrote a first, this is the second edition, which was revised and expanded. The first edition I wrote in 2015. And at that time, I was trying to, let us say, I was trying to save Francis by, aligning him with,
Yeah, we all were. We all were at
yeah,
that point. Yeah,
exactly.
we were clinging by our fingernails to some hermeneutic of continuity
That's
at that.
exactly right. So I was trying to connect him with Vatican II, with John Paul II, with Benedict. Um, And particularly with respect to Vatican II, I decided in the end, uh, it was the way I interpreted him. It was the way I interpreted, that paragraph from John the 23rd's opening address, where he makes the distinction between the sacred doctrines and their formulations. And he's appealing there. John the 23rd is appealing there to Vatican One, and Vatican One there is referring us to Vincent of Lorenz, the Communitorium of Vincent of Lorenz, where Vincent makes that distinction between the propositional truths of faith and their formulation. But he has that subordinate clause where he says that the formulation has to keep the same meaning and the same judgment. So judgment there, sententia refers to, I always follow the translation of Father Komonchak, who translated and sententia, and even, Denzinger, which was in English, it was translated by Bob Fastigi. And
Yeah, yeah.
anyway, so they translate it rightly, it seems to me, as judgment. So the judgment of truth there. And that's because if for the meaning to remain the same, um, it has to be consistent with the judgment of truth that's made there. So in that first edition of mine, Francis cites um,
Vincent.
Vincent on these matters, but he doesn't cite the subordinate. He doesn't cite the subordinate clause. Keeping the same meaning and the same judgment. And that should have been already a kind of a hint to me that there was some problem here. Um, because there were like Peter Hebelwaith and others who interpreted John the 23rd, and they claimed that John the 23rd used, never referred to the subordinate clause, keeping the same meaning and the same judgment, that he only made the distinction between, the teaching of the church and its formulation. there was a review of Hebelwaite's book by a Dutch professor who taught it in Rome, and he reviewed Hebelwaite's book and showed that Hebelwaite, I don't know how you could otherwise say, Hebelwaite was lying, he said. And how did he know that? Because he hauled out the recording at Vatican II, where John the 23rd, in fact, does refer us to, to Vincent and the distinction then, not just the distinction, but that it has to keep uh, the same meaning and the same judgment. Now, why is this all important? Uh, after a few years later, and whatever complications arose in understanding Francis, it seemed to me that there was some reason why he didn't cite that. Um, so in the first chapter of my book, where I lay out what Vatican II was about, in my view, it's Lorenian in orientation, uh, precisely having to do with what's being reformulated, and the fact that it has to keep the same meaning, the same judgment, are those propositional truths of faith. Now, I argue in my book, in the first chapter, that Francis um, diminishes the significance of propositional truths of faith. Uh, he also, in a conversation he had with he's dead now, this atheist, I forget his name right now, but
Scalp,
this
yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Calipari, I think, the atheist, he's asked the question about about the proposition, is there absolute truth? And Francis says that he doesn't speak about absolute truth. Um, Let me get you. He says, so in a letter of the 4th of September 2013 to a non-believer, Francis responds to the question of Eugenio Scalfari, a journalist of the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. And one of his questions to Francis asked whether there is, quote, no absolute and therefore no absolute truth, but only a series of relative and subjective truths. Now, Francis doesn't define subjective truth. Yet you could go to Lumen Fidei, the encyclical, the first encyclical. I say somewhere else that I don't believe that there's much of that encyclical that Francis wrote, like the epistemology of faith, the distinction between belief in and belief that, the fides qua creditur and the fides quae creditur. All of those distinctions, they're not part of Francis's vocabulary, I would
Right,
say.
right, right.
Um, so, but here, Francis says, to begin with, this is his answer to Sculpture. To begin with, I would not speak about absolute truth, even for believers, in the sense that absolute is that which is disconnected and bereft of all relationship. Truth, according to the Christian faith, is the love of God for us in Jesus Christ. Therefore, truth is a relationship. Now, I say in my commentary on that, I'll say, well, the knowledge of truth involves a relationship, but truth itself is something, if a proposition is going to be true, it's true because what it asserts is in fact the case about objective reality. Truth itself is independent in that sense of the knower. The knowledge of truth is not independent of the knower, and so it does
Right,
involve
right.
relationship. As such, he says, each one of us, this is Francis, the truth and expresses it from within, that is to say, according to one's own circumstances, culture, and situation in life. Then he says, this does not mean that truth is variable and subjective, quite the contrary, but it does signify that it comes to us always and only as a way and a life, and so on. So the fact that he's diminishes the significance of propositional truth, the fact that he's reluctant to speak even of absolute truth, this reluctance comes especially to the fore, I say in the book, in the chapter on interreligious dialogue. Yes, he says interreligious dialogue, you can enter that dialogue with the full content of Christian commitment, with the sense that you can learn from the other that you're having a conversation with. What Ratzinger says, you're trying to understand the otherness of the other and so on. But then Francis says you have to withdraw your claims to absolute truth. Um, so that's to me that
What
was
does he
all
mean? Hang on a second. When you say we need to withdraw, there are those who would say that in interreligious dialogue, the Christian should, in a sense, bracket their faith, set it aside temporarily in order to engage the other, precisely within their context to sort of bracket it. But that's different from saying withdraw. You need to withdraw it.
renouncing his very words in several places. He says, to dialogue means to believe that the other has something worthwhile to say and to entertain his or her point of view and perspective. Engaging in dialogue does not mean renouncing our own ideas and traditions, but the renouncing of the claim that they alone are valid or absolute.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, that's bad. That's bad.
well, it is bad. It is bad. I don't understand what it could. Well, I go and I discuss that here, and I discuss it in my book that came out last year.
On singularity.
Yeah, the thing. And I have a chapter again where I go back to discuss, interreligious dialogue. I discuss, Fratelli Tutti and all that kind of stuff. It just seems to me that there's something, at the very least, confusing.
Well, yes, because Christianity alone amongst all the religions of the world does make a striking claim, and that is that God became a human being, and that represents the absolute revelation of who God is, what God wants us to know who God is in human form, in Christ Jesus. And that is the scandal of particularity, as you correctly point out in your book.
Right.
And for the Christian, therefore, in a sense, to withdraw the particularity of Christ from the discussion is precisely to withdraw the Christian faith in toto
That,
from the
that's
discussion.
that's exactly right. And um, so
In
you
other words,
have
I don't mean to interrupt again. In other words, what is being
no,
appealed to instead of the particularity of Christ is some vague, generic religious sense that a common ground of religiosity, natural religion to which we can both appeal and then perhaps build off of. But that's a really wrong-headed way to go about it.
right, right. I said at one point, does he just mean that God has not left himself without witness, and through general revelation you can find
Right.
elements of truth and all that? That's true. That's fine. But he doesn't say that. To say that to renounce, the unique and uniquely valid and absolute claims of Christianity. Mm.
Well,
Anyway,
let
so
me
go
go
ahead.
ahead. No,
No, I
you
was
go
going to
ahead.
say, so as far as Vatican II is concerned, since he doesn't, and this was the change in my judgment in the second edition, since he doesn't affirm the the distinction that Vincent Loren makes regarding that when alternative formulations, have to keep the same meaning and the same judgment of truth. It's like when students ask me, and I've talked about Vincent when I did a STL class this summer on doctrinal development, and I say, look, is the idea that somehow same-sex marriage is just a development of marriage, conjugal marriage, is just not the case. Because the doctrinal, the conceptual, the hardcore, if Newman and as well as Vincent, because Newman is influenced by Vincent, it has to keep the same meaning and the same judgment. Well, uh, if as Jesus says in Mark 10, when he's asked about divorce, he refers us back to the creation text of Genesis 1:27. God created man in his image, male and female, he created him. Therefore, Jesus says, a man shall leave his mother and his father, cleave unto his wife, and the two, which two, male and female, shall become one flesh. Therefore, sexual differentiation is a fundamental prerequisite for the two to become one flesh. So that's of course lost, rejected in same-sex marriage. So it seems to me losing that leaves Francis with the idea. So you just have the doctrine and the formulations. You've not cited the crucial subordinate clause that Vincent cites, that Vatican I cites, and Vatican I is citing Vincent, that it has to keep the same meaning and the same judgment. What happens is that his understanding of Vatican II, in my judgment, becomes simply a matter of reformulating and recontextualizing the teaching. Uh, Reformulating and recontextualizing the teaching, reinterpreting it. And that's the way that, you have Catholic theologians like, what's his name from Boston College, but the whole range of them.
Mark Messon?
Uh, no, I forget his name right now in my mind. But in any case, so it seems to me that's where, then they link from Gaudium et Spes, paragraph, I think it's paragraph 16, where it says that the law of evangelization is recontextualization and all of that. So if you lose or diminish the significance of propositional truth, which is connected to me, in my judgment, to his diminishing the significance of doctrines. If you diminish the significance of absolute truth, and then thirdly, you have Francis's, from Gaudium et Spes, no, from Francis's Evangelii Gaudium in paragraph 231, where you have these, where he sets out these three or four basic fundamental principles. And one of them is that reality is greater than ideas. Sure, in one sense, that's true. That was initially the way I interpreted.
But what
Well,
does it mean?
what does it mean exactly? And so I say in my comment on this, I say this idea taken seriously is self-refuting. It's only through ideas, concepts, words that we can apprehend the meaning of reality at all or know that it's greater than ideas. Now, of course, his understanding of this, again, you can link it back to the diminishing the significance of propositions, of doctrine, um, the true status of dogmatic formulations. And so then I ask, are the truths of faith expressed in the creedal statements of Nicaea and Chalcedon, more particularly orthodoxy, just ideas, mere theory? Because that's what he sometimes says. Mere thoughts or mere sets of words altogether separate from God? Or do they convey or grasp divine reality itself? The truth about the reality, fulfilling the truth-attaining capacity of the human mind to lay hold of divine reality. Now, if you were sitting there with the Pope and you asked him there, maybe he'd give you the right answer. But the fact is, all of this is part of the confusion that I think Francis has generated, and so that's why in the title of my book, I say that Vatican I is a contested Lyrinian legacy, I say. And Francis, it seems to me, has contributed to that because for all of these reasons, if you diminish the significance of propositions and hence of doctrine, if you diminish the significance of absolute truth, if you think that doctrines are just words, ideas, theories, as he sometimes says, well, what is it that we know as Christians?
Yeah, Pope Francis would definitely make a very poor Wittgensteinian because it's very clear that, to me, that he is appealing to the category of the ineffable, that there are these pre-linguistic truths that we intuit in our soul somehow, before we put them into ideas and words, that there's this under, it goes back to the thing about interreligious dialogue too.
Right, right, right.
We can set aside propositions and all these silly ideas because underneath it all, we have all intuited this divine presence which remains kind of ineffable. But there's a slipperiness. I mean, even Thomas Aquinas, remember, in the Summa, quid recipitor secundum modum recipientis recipitor. What is received according to the mode of the recipient. St. Augustine said, Si comprehendis non est Deus. If you can comprehend it, it's not God. Again, Aquinas in the Summa says, in faith we are united to God as to one unknown. The Christian tradition has always, the Catholic intellectual tradition has always affirmed a sort of apophatic moment within the cataphatic truths of revelation.
Right.
Nevertheless, they never use that apophatic moment to then undermine the cataphatic truths in the propositions. We've always recognized that the propositions are second order meditations by the church, inspired by the Holy Spirit, to put into words certain truths. But as Balthasar says, even as God unveils himself, there's still a veiling because God is the infinite one.
Of
So
course, of course.
there is this, but there is almost this sense when you're reading Pope Francis that he's appealing to something here different from that old-fashioned apophatic moment that the church fathers always counsel us, to follow.
Right, right. No, I think that's true, and it reflects itself. And here's the my approach to Francis has always been measured. I've never been one of those who just comes out with a scattergun, and just tears,
A
Yeah,
blunderbuss,
yeah,
God.
exactly.
Yeah.
No, and also it's been an approach that's rooted in what he says. And so then you ask questions, or like you said, well, what does he mean when he says that we have to renounce the unique validity and absolute nature of our beliefs? What does that mean? Um, so the same kind of so before we transition, so for me, he doesn't understand Vatican II. He doesn't understand Vatican II because if Vatican II's legacy is a Lorenian legacy, as I said, and I start there from John the 23rd, his quoting Vatican I, and Vatican I is quoting Vincent of Lorenz, and then that key subordinate clause in both in John the 23rd and in Vincent, that the formulation has to keep the same meaning and the same judgment. And so I think he's moved in the direction I say, excuse me, I think he's moved in or at least it's possible to understand him. Um, it's possible to understand him as saying that, it's about recontextualizing and reformulating the teaching. Um, but then there's no safeguard, as it were, for the continuity. Yes, of course. I always say it's not just hermeneutics of continuity. People misunderstand Benedict there because he says it's the hermeneutics of continuity in the renewal. So there's an element of course, of reformulating, renewal, just like to take the two great examples. I mean, Mortalium Animus of Pius XI, he rejects ecumenism. Uh, Unitatis Redintegratio affirms it. Is there just a mere contradiction there? What are we to make of? I argue that you have to read the text of Mortalium Animus and Vatican II's Unitatis Redintegratio in such a way that everything that Pius rejected about ecumenism, Vatican II still rejects. Vatican II, rejected an ecclesiological relativism.
Yes.
It
Yes.
rejected the branch theory of Christianity as if you have the trunk Christianity and then all these branches, Catholicism, Methodism, Presbyterianism, and so on and so
All
on.
it's doing, right, all it's doing is embracing the old patristic idea of the logoi spermaticoi and the spoils of Egypt and so on, that there are truths out there scattered around amidst the errors
Right,
in, in
right.
other religions and in other Christian denominations. And so perhaps we can set aside, our differences just a bit in order to increase ecumenism by focusing on those bits and pieces of truth. But that is definitely not religious relativism.
No, no, of course not. And then, of course, the way I've argued it is if you look at paragraph 17 of Unitatis Redintegratio, it makes that very Lorenian distinction between the propositional truths of faith and their formulations. And it says it's not surprising if one tradition or another has a deeper grasp of those propositional truths, a deeper grasp such that they may give a more uh, uh, articulate formulation of those truths. And so you can have unity is not the same thing as uniformity. There can be unity at the level of the doctrinal truths, and yet there can be diversity, but the diversity is at the level of the formulation so that I think
Yeah.
Vatican II, John Paul II, they were receptive ecumenists, so that when John Paul says ecumenism is not just simply an exchange of ideas, it's an exchange of gifts, he says. But the gifts are not at the level of, let's say the tradition I'm the most familiar with, the Reformed tradition. It's not that they're telling us something that we don't know, but they're giving a fuller expression of it such that, and Vatican II says that in paragraph 17, and also in paragraph 4, such that it can contribute to a fuller awareness of the truth, such that we can live the Christian life
Yeah.
more fully. So,
Yes.
so in that sense, um, and he never, you see, in my chapter on ecumenism in Francis, it just seems to me again there's an ambiguity here. There's a confusion. Unity and diversity. He doesn't seem to begin with the thesis that there is only one church, and so then you have to ask the question: what about unity, ecclesial unity and diversity within the one church? We don't accept the view, Vatican II doesn't accept the idea that, yes, the church that Christ founded subsists in its own right in the Catholic Church, but it doesn't follow from that that therefore outside the visible boundaries of the church, all you have is a wasteland or emptiness. No, that's just not true. I always say anybody who thinks that has not read. I'm not even saying that they haven't read, Martin Luther and John Calvin, but after 500 years, there have been so many great, Protestant theologians. They haven't read anything. So to say that outside the visible mind of the church, all you have is an ecclesial wasteland and emptiness, it seems to me is just wrong. John Paul II says, that. That those elements of truth and sanctification, as we read in Gaudium in Lumen Gentium 8, those elements of truth and sanctification that exist outside the visible boundaries of the church, they exist they don't exist in an ecclesial vacuum. They exist in an ecclesial context, of course. So we have to ask the question, uh, what about ecclesial unity and diversity within the one church, which is the Catholic Church? How do we account for that? Well, Francis doesn't do any of that. It's all kind of, you enter into conversation, you recognize each other, and so you think that somehow unity is generated from diversity, as opposed to understanding that a one church already exists, and yet at the same time we want to understand the diversity, ecclesial diversity that exists outside the church, and how is ecclesial unity and diversity understood with respect to the one church. All of that, it seems to me, is
Yeah.
at the very best you can. It's just confusing.
Well, there. Okay. That's my next question, and it's got a kind of got two parts. To focus on the word confusing. Uh, the fact is, despite everything that we've been talking about, and I agree with everything that you've said, there's a confusing element to the Francis papacy as well, in the form of deep inconsistencies. Because after you've pointed out all these things correctly about how Francis doesn't really approach Vatican II properly, and yet, and yet, Pope Francis doesn't seem to be a full-on rupturist. He doesn't he doesn't buy into the post-Vatican II narrative of those rupturists who say Vatican II represents a reset button and we can just sort of reinvent Catholicism as we see fit, permanent revolution, as Father Chenu said in like the 70s. And what we've done is instituted a permanent revolution. Francis doesn't seem to buy into that idea. Furthermore, along those lines, he has said things that make it sound as if, well, yeah, Christianity is the preeminent religion in the world. Christ is the singular manifestation of God in the flesh. And he
Mhm.
didn't give the liberals in the church really much that they wanted. He didn't give them women priests. He didn't change the teaching on contraception. He didn't give them women deacons. He didn't change the language of the catechism with regard to homosexuality as great, intrinsically disordered, even though they wanted him to. Uh,
Right.
he didn't even give us married priests, which he could have done with a stroke of a pen, since it's just a church discipline. He appealed explicitly to John Paul II's teaching about women's ordination as normative and binding. So
Mhm.
there is this confusing element within Francis, right?
Well, yes, and the confusion is generated, it seems to me, by the his understanding of the church. It seems to me that the idea of synodality, despite his claim that this is not a parliament system, we're not trying to revise doctrine. The fact is, he opens the door to at least people thinking that things are going to change because
Right.
because synodality, I always remember there's an essay that Ratzinger wrote in 1975. It was published in that book that Ignatius published on fundamental theology, and he has an essay there on 10 years after Vatican II.
Oh, it's called Principles of Catholic Theology, and
Yeah, that's what the book is called.
the
But he
chapter is worth the price of the whole book.
Right. So, but he says there that you had people after Vatican II who wanted to have an understanding of Vatican II, where Vatican II was just the conciliar consciousness. You continue
Yeah.
to reflect. You continue to reflect as if there isn't a deposit of faith, as if there isn't a tradition there, as if there isn't a dogmatic conceptual hardcore, and you're just you just continue to think about these things as if somehow the point of Vatican II, and this is how some of these folk interpreted this, as if the point of Vatican II was just to somehow have an understanding of the church where you were continuing to reflect on this teaching. And well, not just to reflect, but also to continue to reflect on what the teaching of the church is on these matters. Now, I always go back to the 1975, no, 85, when John Paul II called an extraordinary synod having to do with
Yeah.
the reception of Second Vatican II, and the bishops of that's another issue. The bishops, it's a bishops synod, and Francis made it into a synod where you had uh,
Lay people.
laity and lay people. Okay, so but that synod lays out six principles. Uh, the first principle has to do with affirming, the priority of the constitutions on liturgy, on revelation, on the church, and then also on culture, Gaudium et Spes, and so on. And so that there exists a priority there with respect to those constitutions. And so you can't possibly think, and I've heard people say this, that Nostra Aetate was somehow an advance on the church's teaching on the church, or that Gaudium et Spes was somehow a development. Uh,
Yeah.
all of that. So the constitutions, the decrees, and the declarations, they have to be understood with respect to the constitutions. And then it says the second principle is that it says you have to read, uh, these texts in their entirety, so that you can see, um, if you're going to do intertextuality between these things. So you have to read them, coherently in that sense. The third principle, of course, which is a crucial one, was that you can't play off doctrine over against the spirit of the text. Because
Right.
you had people, as you know, I mean, you had people, the spirit of the council relativized the authority of what was written there. People
Well,
who then,
hang on, hang on,
yeah,
if I may interrupt. In that same essay on Gaudium et Spes that Ratzinger talks about in Principles of Catholic Theology, he goes to talking about Gaudium et Spes, that the rupturists, the constant revolutionists, are saying that Gaudium et Spes represents the one only document of the council worth paying attention to, in the sense that it's the last document promulgated, and it is that document to which everything preceding it was leading, and that Gaudium et Spes, in
right.
a sense, relativizes the dogmatic constitution. Everything has to be read in the light of the turn to the world and all this kind of stuff.
Right. So yeah, that's right. And so that's why, what's called actually a message to the people of God in the final report. So again, I just have it right before me. The theological interpretation of the conciliar doctrine must show attention to all the documents
Yes.
in themselves and in their close interrelationship in such a way that the integral meaning of the council's affirmations, often very complex, might be understood and expressed. And then again, the four constitutions of the council are the hermeneutical key, it says, to the other documents, namely the council's 9 decrees and 3 declarations. And then the pastoral import, this was the third principle, of the documents ought not to be separated from or set in opposition to their doctrinal content. That's something that we still face. Um, Fourth, no opposition may be made between the spirit and the letter of Vatican II. And that's also something that happened. People tend, whatever the spirit was, the spirit led to the relativizing of the text, of the literal sense of the text, of what was written. And then it says the council must be interpreted in continuity with the great tradition of the church, including earlier councils. The church is one and the same throughout all the councils. And then Vatican II should be, that's the last principle, should be interpreted as illuminating the problems of our own day. Now, yes, so yes, of course, Francis, yeah, he didn't deal with go for women priests, although he he kept keeping the conversation about women deacons open, despite the fact that they had I don't know how many conversations and so on and so on, and they always the conversations that they had came to the same conclusion about that, and then it was always open. But
Yeah.
it seems to me that here's the thing. Although Francis didn't make any of these changes that you referred to, the fact is his ecclesiology was such, especially with the emphasis on synodality, was such that it made it seem as if all of this was open to discussion. All of these people, you remember, even the relator, the cardinal from
Hollerich, Luxembourg.
Ulrich, exactly. Not just him, but others, they made it seem as if, oh, we're going to be talking about, the church's sexual ethics, homosexuality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it created the impression as if the church is essentially ongoing discussion about where things are at. And remember, if you remember what I said about the interpretation of Vatican II, where Vatican II is just about reformulating and recontextualizing. They all appeal to the law of evangelization as it's referred to in Gaudium et Spes, and so we have to attend to There's the emphasis on the listening church. What happened to the teaching church? I'm not. Of course, we want to listen. We want to try to understand. What the culture is doing, but that can never be, a motive for renewal. Ressourcement has to do with, the authoritative, going back, deepening our understanding of the authoritative source of faith so that we might more effectively address the issues of the culture, such as, I mean, in my view, John Paul II's Theology of the Body is really doing just that. And that was in the mid 80s. I mean, I always say the theology of the body is really an anthropology where sexual differentiation is crucial. John Paul says in those chapters on marriage and the sacrament of marriage that the sacrament of marriage can't be valid if you don't have sexual difference. You see, it's not. I
Right,
would often
right.
tell the students, don't don't tell me that marriage is just about love, because then you'll have that person who says, two men or two women love each other, so why can't they be married? Love is the integrating principle of marriage. Marriage is an ethical community, even an ethical covenant, but that covenant is grounded in sexual difference, and you can't separate, the Pope says in the Theology about, you can't separate uh, the union of two people from sexual differentiation, and so you're not going to have a valid sacrament without that.
Yeah.
So what is it that John Paul II wasn't thinking? Yes, he was addressing the issues of the culture, but that didn't mean that he thought that we could revise the teaching, you see. And
Yeah.
that's the impression. Even if Francis didn't accept that, that's the impression that synodality has created.
Right. See, my theory is that, and I agree with you, Eduardo, uh, and I've noted this in various things that I've written as well, that Francis says all the right things in terms of, well, often says all the right
All the
things
right things.
with regard to orthodoxy. But then if you look at his episcopal appointments or who he puts in charge of
Oh,
things, it
yes,
all leaned in the progressive direction. Whether you're talking Cardinal McElroy, openly dissents from church's sexual teaching, the elevation of Father Martin and his profile, he clearly dissents from church teaching, and I don't care what he says.
right,
You put Cardinal Hollerich in charge of the synod. He's an open dissenter from the church's sexual teaching. It often seems to me, therefore, that Pope Francis definitely agreed with the more liberal positions, the rupturist positions, but knew if he implemented these things by fiat as Pope that he would create a schism. And so
hmm
he chose to implement policies where the church would change gradually via a kind of drift, a sort of directed drift, not just an aimless drift, but through his appointments, a real drift in a certain direction
right,
without putting all of his cards on the table, hoping that he was simply laying the groundwork for these profound changes and the church would evolve into them, all right,
right.
over time. Now that's my theory, but it's the one that makes more, I think, the most sense of what seem to be contradictions in his papacy. But I don't, if we interpret it as that he was trying to accomplish something through a kind of directed drift, then I think it begins to make sense.
Well, and that's what, you're absolutely right about the appointments. Good heavens. Um, but also as I was trying to say, the ecclesiology, the synodality, and it becomes a kind of local Catholicism. I mean, yes, of course, he says no. We're not trying to change the church's teaching. Synodality is not a parliament, et cetera, et cetera. But then why are we having all these conversations about
Yeah,
these matters in the actual synod? Why are there these groups, as it were, that break up and have their discussions, and they're discussing this, that, and the other? Why is it that I'm opposed to, the self-identification in the church of, these what I call these morally and spiritually problematic relationships, in particular, homosexuals and so on and so on. Why do we now seem to accept this, the self-identification of LGBT, blah, 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 as if somehow it's it just seems to me to be denying. It's like using the term irregular relationship, to talk about
Yeah,
uh,
and the fact is too, this what I call the theory of drift helps to explain too why in a supposedly listening in synodal church she seemed not to want to listen at all to traditionalists or the people that
exactly.
love the Latin Mass, and he put them down so strongly because those were the Catholics in the church who he knew were going to call his bluff, and they were
Right,
calling his bluff, and they were
right,
saying,
right,
oh,
right,
hold on a second, what about
right,
this, what about Amoris Laetitia chapter 8, what
right,
about
right.
Fiducium
I know, I
Supplicans,
know.
what about all of these things? And they were calling his bluff, and he couldn't have it. This was
No, no.
a fly in the ointment, if you want to change the
Right,
metaphor here,
right, right.
that he had to suppress if his drift was going to be
Well, and he
successful.
did. And then also, I mean, in the rest of my book, these are folk chapters where again I deal with matters of confusion. In chapter 2, I discuss mercy and justice meet at the cross. Now, if you pursue, Francis's discussions of the atonement, uh, you know, it's clear that he doesn't want to separate or lose sight of the justice of God. I always quote there's a statement from the Niebuhrs, H. Richard and Reinhold Niebuhr, mid-century Protestant theologians, and H. Richard, he wrote one of his books was called The Kingdom of God in America in the
Right.
1930s. And he himself he was what we would call neo-orthodox, so a neoliberal, as it were, but he wasn't a sort of a classical liberal. And he defined classical liberalism this way: a God without wrath brought men without sin into a kingdom without judgment through the ministrations of a Christ without a cross. Now, I had people that I know well, like in evangelicals and Catholics together that I belong to, who just took Francis to be, just an old-fashioned liberal on these kind of matters. And so I tried to address the issue of, well, what's the relationship between justice and mercy in Francis's atonement account? And I tried to do that in the light of John Paul II's his encyclical on mercy, to see that there was some continuity there, and there is some continuity there. But of course, you have to do the work, because on its face, all the emphasis on mercy, seems to diminish the significance of judgment, and you would never hear the word wrath as such coming out of the mouth of Francis. And then, so questions about judgment, questions about sin. It's like yesterday. So there's Father Martin, and Leo is following Francis. He wants an open and welcoming church to, LGBT, whatever. And then you ask yourself, but does that welcoming and openness include the call to repentance, and so on? And well, it doesn't. So to me, yes, we, Christ calls all sinners, but there has to be a recognition that you're a sinner. There has to be a recognition of the call to repentance. So I try in this chapters to sort of consider, well, what is the relationship between mercy and justice? How is it that mercy and justice meet at the cross? Can we find that in Francis's views, or is his view just another? You remember Christian Smith in his book, he talks about moralistic therapeutic deism.
Right.
Is
Right.
Francis' view just another case of moralistic therapeutic deism? And again, I argue that it isn't. So at the end of the day, I'm positive. But of course, that doesn't mean that his views haven't generated all kinds of confusion. There's also, I have a chapter on, because this was also confusing, the relationship between Christ and the law. What is the significance of the law in Francis's reflections on the moral life? I say the Pope's overall emphasis on the error of legalism is such that he never addresses the antithesis of legalism, namely antinomianism. And we surely live in an age of antinomianism, moral subjectivism, relativism. Moreover, he never actually addresses the question if the moral law is good, which Francis surely believes it is, and then I refer to Amoris Laetitia, paragraph 295, then what is its place in the Christian life? And that too was even I'm not even yes the natural law, but even the Ten Commandments, even in his reflections on virtue in one of his documents, it's all about or his reflections on the Christian life, and he brings up the whole matter of virtue. He never brings up the question of the Ten Commandments. So to me, again, that was also uh, confusion regarding the place of the moral law. Regarding also that comes out in Amoris Laetitia. I always say if there was no eighth chapter in Amoris Laetitia, which deals with the whole question of
Right.
the divorce and civilly remarried, all of that, nobody would have paid any attention to Amoris Laetitia.
No, because it was just a repetition of standard Catholic teaching.
Exactly.
And, and
It was the whole emphasis, it was the whole point of trying to find some justification, moral justification for the divorced and civilly remarried to receive communion.
it is. And this is key. I think this is key because I think it's an insight into the mind of Pope Francis. Forget the ambiguous footnote for a second where he
That's
says,
irrelevant, it seems to me.
yeah, where he says, After a period of discernment, pastors
Yeah,
can
yeah, yeah,
decide, blah, blah,
yeah,
blah."
yeah.
There's that one significant line. I don't remember which section you would know. I can't remember now, where he says that people who live in difficult circumstances that are not copacetic with the law of the moral law of the church
Right.
can nevertheless, if that's the best they can offer to God at this
That's
moment,
right.
they can have a quiet conscience knowing that God blesses
That's
their
right.
situation. Now, I call that best I can doism. That Pope Francis
Right.
was an advocate of best I can doism with a very dumbed down sense of the capacity of human beings to know the moral truth and to live it
Right.
via the cross and
Right.
asceticism.
Right.
And so no matter how many
Right.
times
Right.
a proper paragraph would have said, no matter how many times you stumble, grace is always there to pick you back up and repent. There's no such thing as you have to choose between two evils. If you're living in
That's
an
his view, I think.
yeah,
The
if you're
logic
living,
of
yeah, go
two
ahead, go
evils.
ahead.
No, no, no. I 100% agree with you. The fact is that Francis's view turns the obliging force of the law into an aspiring force. It's
Yes,
what you have to aspire to, you
it
see.
becomes an ideal.
Exactly, exactly. And that's why in my chapter on the controversial chapter 8 of Amoris Laetitia, I discussed this despite his objections, I discussed this in the context of the
By the way, I
distinction.
don't mean to interrupt, but for the sake of my listeners, can you direct them what section of Morris Letizia is it where he makes that statement about,
Um, it's in, let's see. Well,
well, it's chapter 8, wherever it
it's
is.
chapter 8, and you're right. That's a crucial paragraph, and that's a paragraph that was even used by Cardinal Supich to justify homosexuals living together who are then receiving communion. He says, so long as they're aspiring, if this is the best that they're doing under the
Hmm.
circumstances, so the moral law doesn't have an obliging force any longer. It has an aspiring force. And so this is where the distinction that John Paul II draws in Familiaris Consortium.
Familiaris consortio, law of gradualism versus gradualism of the
Exactly. And
law.
so Francis says, oh, no, it's not the gradualism of the law, but in fact, it is the gradualism of the law. And it's not just the law of gradualists. Everybody accepts the law of gradualists. We're sinners, and so we have to. You
Well, for the
strive.
sake of the listeners, explain the difference between the law of
Well,
gradualism and the
the law of
gradualism of the law.
gradualists, the law of gradualists is such that you sin, you strive after, becoming a more morally mature person, and so you're imperfect, et cetera, et cetera. But then, as you said earlier, you go to confession, as in the first letter of John, in the first chapter, in the eighth verse, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all
So
unrighteousness.
you make progress gradually, and pastors recognize that.
Exactly, exactly. So, but you have to recognize that you actually sinned.
Right. And
And
that the
so,
law is not an aspiring ideal, but something
no,
you're
the law is
commanded
not
to
an
live.
exactly. This is exactly what John Paul II rejects in paragraph 102 of Veritatis Splendor, that
So
we
then what
can't,
is the law of gradualism?
the gradualism of the law is where the law becomes situation and person specific. So it's something, so like, as Francis says, you're doing the best that you can. So the priest says to you, well, if you're doing the best that you can, that's all that God can ask of you. And if the best that you can is in fact sinning,
Sinful.
sinful, um, then as long as you're aspiring, as long as you are aspiring after, the moral law, then it's okay. It's okay. You can like,
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know what's really bad about this too, Edward, and I'm sorry I keep cutting you off,
no,
but
no, not at
your
all, man.
words are so loaded with significance. I can't help but comment on them. But the fact is, what really makes the gradualism of the law so bad is that you're talking here about penitents who are coming to a priest in confession, let's say, who know that they're sinning objectively, who know this, and yet find themselves as they might say to the priest, it's impossible for me to live. Now, the
Right,
priest, instead of grabbing them by the hand and saying, okay, but here's why you really need to try harder, if you will,
right, right, right.
says, okay, well, if that's the best you can do, then you're not really sinning. But that's really what you're not dealing here. In other words, this is my point. You're not dealing here with people in invincible ignorance. That
No, 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 no.
you're dealing here with people who know the church's teaching and say, I can't live this.
I can't do this. I can't live this.
And so the priest says, okay,
Well, if you're doing, but he'll say, Francis, I think, would say, you still have to be striving. Right now, I can't do it, but you still have to be striving after fulfilling the demands of the law, even if now you can't. It's paragraph 303 of Amoris Laetitia,
okay, yeah.
paragraph 303, where he says that the individual can also recognize with sincerity and honesty what for now is the most generous response which can be given to God, and come to see with a certain moral security that it is what God Himself, not only it's what God Himself is asking, and amid the concrete complexity of one's limits, while yet not fully the objective ideal. And so, yes, in paragraph 303. So what happens there is that it's not just about the law of gradualness, which is you're striving to attain, you're a sinner. Yeah, that's crucial to the law of gradualness, that you recognize that you're a sinner, and that as I cited from John, if you confess your sins, he is faithful and just to forgive you your sins and to cleanse you from all unrighteousness. That's not what Francis is saying there. The gradualness of the law is where the moral law becomes situation and person specific. So right now, this is the best that you're doing, and that's the precept, the moral precept that you're living by. And yes, you recognize that the moral precept that you're living by is not the fullness of the moral law, but since this is the best that you're doing,
Well,
You know,
there's and applied to the divorce and remarriage thing. The subtle implication of Amoris Laetitia, chapter 8, its justification, is
I
that
agree.
for many couples in invalid marriages, second marriages, sexual continence is not possible. It'll harm their marriage
Well,
if
that's
they
the
don't have.
logic of that distinction between the lesser of two evils.
Right, right.
Is it if I stop having sex with this woman, that's going to affect my children, you see, because that may lead to divorce, et cetera, et cetera. That'll affect the family. So and that's a greater evil, I think the Pope is implying, than the evil of continuing to have sexual relations with the woman
Yeah.
that you've married civilly. So again, the graduates of the law, here's a quote from John Paul II, as if there were different degrees or forms of precept in God's law for different individuals and situations. Um, And so it seems to me, despite Francis's protest to the contrary, and also his interpreters like Pedro Gabriel, you see, he denies that this is that Francis here is attempting to justify because he keeps appealing to the whole business about the individuals uh, doesn't have the wherewithal. He's there's circumstances here where which
Well, yeah, that's the whole shtick of where Peter is crowd. Mike Lewis, Pedro
yeah,
Gabriel,
yeah, that's where they're
and
all
Andrew
at.
Lakutis, all of them say all Pope Francis is doing is pointing to mitigating circumstances
Right,
and
exactly.
how that affects subjective appropriation of the truth and blah blah blah. No, that's not what he's saying, and they're
No,
wrong
no,
about
it's
that.
you're absolutely right. Here I quote Cardinal Supich. Oh Lord in heaven. Um, it's
Yeah.
just it's a sad state of affairs. The Supich is telling these homosexuals who are living together. Or even Francis, he had circumstances where and I said that, he would justify, uh, individuals, not just homos, but heterosexuals who are living together. And he wants to welcome them into the church and so on and so on. And this is, and he doesn't, it's not like he says, I'm welcoming you into the church as sinners and there's mercy and forgiveness and so on. No, all of that is missing. Uh, and again, John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor, um, he brings out this point, this where he rejects the kind of a dualism, he says. Um, some kind of double status of moral truth,
Right.
from an obliging to an aspiring force. Um, Beyond the
Yeah.
doctrinal and abstract level, he says, one would have to acknowledge the priority of a certain more concrete existential consideration. The latter, by taking account of circumstance and the situation, could legitimately be the base of certain exceptions to the general rule and thus permit one to do in practice and in good conscience what is qualified as intrinsically evil by the moral law. A separation or even opposition is thus established in some cases between the teaching of the precept, which is valid in general, and the norm of the individual conscience, which would in fact make the final decision about what is good and what is evil. On this basis, an attempt is made to legitimize so-called pastoral solutions, he says, contrary to the teaching of the magisterium, and to justify a creative hermeneutic according to which the moral conscience is in no way obliged in every case by a particular negative precept. That's also a distinction that Francis does not make between a distinction that Aquinas draws between negative moral precepts that are always and everywhere valid, and then positive precepts which have a presumptive moral validity, for which he says there can be a certain exception. Um, anyway, so clearly, Amoris Laetitia, chapter 8, created a great deal of confusion in the
Yeah.
church about the status of moral absolutes, about even the status of the moral law, whether has an obliging force or just an aspiring force, about the understanding of conscience, about the logic of two evils. Remember, as you said, Pedro, Gabriel, and these others, they don't accept the idea that Francis is trying to justify that the divorced and civilly remarried or anybody else uh, can receive communion. It's all about mitigating circumstances, but he's not trying to justify. I remember I had a debate with him on this, and I said, it seems to me that at the end of the day, you have a logic of two evils here. You have to choose between which evil is lesser. And for Francis, the lesser of two evils is for two people that have sex because the impact that the breakup of the marriage has on the children is a greater evil.
And notice something here too, and this is key with regard to sexual continence within marriage. The idea that, okay, it's for some individuals, sexual continence is impossible without harming the marriage. And after all, sex is an integral part of one of the natural goods of marriage. Well, that's to treat the invalid marriage as a marriage, which it isn't.
Right,
Okay, not
right,
from a Catholic sacramental point of view.
right,
All right.
right.
And so what you're saying is, well, that's going to hurt the marriage. Well, it isn't a marriage,
It
and
isn't a
that's the whole
marriage.
point. That's the whole point, which is
That's the
why
whole
you
point.
should not be having sex with your partner.
Right. Right. So that's a chapter, a long chapter. But what I also I wrote this recently in an article for the Catholic thing and the sort of five challenges that Leo the 14th faces in view of marriage. And one of them had to do with the acceptance, the justification legally of same-sex marriage. There's Francis has no discussion of the impact of that on the culture. Um, Secondly, there's also the matter of, as we've been talking about, Amoris Laetitia and trying to provide a justification for the divorce and civilly remarried to receive communion. Thirdly, there's also a place that Francis, in one of his autobiographies, he has in the concluding chapter, he says, no, marriage, he says, is the union of male and female, so sacramentally, so the church doesn't accept uh, same-sex marriage as a marriage. But then he says that homosexual love is a gift. And I go on to discuss it. Well, how can that be? It's a disordered form of love. How can you how can you
Yeah.
make it a gift either naturally or supernaturally? And then, of course, you have all this other business about that we've been talking about. Anyway, so
Well, hang on one second. I'll say about, the gifts that he's referring to, and I've read that same thing. I think he misconstrues them. For example, there can be genuine moral gifts that, say, two gay men can give to one another, but they're the same moral gifts outside of sex. I don't mean sex, but compassion and companionship.
right,
They're the same moral gifts that friendship brings. So,
right, right.
instead of talking about, well, there are gifts in their love for one another. Set that nonsense aside because it plays very poorly in our relativistic pro LGBTQ plus
Well, exactly. And
society.
also, and also we mustn't treat those gifts neutrally in
Right,
a kind of
exactly. That's my
look,
point.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
they take place in a particular context. But again, I don't, well, I don't think there's a place where Francis says, uh, and unfortunately, welcoming Father Francis Martin and telling him that the church, there's openness and welcoming to LGBTQ plus. Where's the affirmation that homosexuality and the homosexual condition is an expression of fallen human nature? Never mind the actual act, but homosexuality, you can't put homosexuality and heterosexuality on a par. Uh,
Bingo. Exactly. And
They
that's the
can't be on a
problem.
par.
Furthermore, it is never acknowledged by Pope Francis or Father Martin and his allies, that the homosexual lifestyle isn't simply running afoul of rules.
No.
The moral law is there for a reason, and the reason is that it is so spiritually disordered that it is disfiguring, and that the homosexual lifestyle, when anybody that knows anything at all about the sociology of the homosexual lifestyle and the gay subculture of Western
Right,
society knows
right,
that it is unbelievably destructive. And
right.
there's very little that is salutary about it at all. And
And I
therefore,
don't,
when you're talking to a 16-year-old confused adolescent boy
right,
who may really be homosexual, right? And you greenlight it as homosexual, oh, the church, just go with it, go with it.
right, right,
You are actually not engaged in an act of mercy at that point. You are doing something vicious at that point because
right.
you are turning that young man over into the clutches of the homosexual subculture. And that is going oftentimes to destroy that young man. Now,
Well,
it also destroys someone of that orientation when they're given nothing but condemnation and you're
sure,
going to
sure,
hell
sure.
and all that kind of. I'm not arguing for lacking in compassion and forgiveness and
Right.
embracing and nurturing and all those sorts of things. It's a false binary to say it's either condemning or it's condoning. That's a
No,
false binary.
no, no. We have to get beyond. Ratzinger says. I remember in his one of his book on the theological highlights of Vatican II, in his discussion of pastoral, he says we have to get beyond, the condemnatory mentality, but we have to pastoral is to present the full truth of the Christian faith. Well, you're not presenting the full truth of the Christian faith if you're not telling this individual that his condition is an expression of fallen human nature, and that if he acts, as the Catechism says, I mean, that acting on these matters is contrary to the will of God, contrary to human nature, and all of that. And so why would he? If you listen to Father Martin, um, why would you have the inclination to go to confession? Because he's not telling you
Right.
you're living in a sinful condition, and et cetera, et cetera. So, and I never ever I've never, in Francis's pontificate, I've never heard him say that about, he may have said it, but I've never heard him say that homosexuality is such and such. So that's an important chapter. Chapter 5 of my book, you know, it's entitled An Integral Hermeneutics of Life. And I say at the beginning of the chapter, throughout the span of his pontificate, Pope Francis has not managed to outrun the confusion that was caused by his pronouncement that, quote, the church's pastoral ministry cannot be obsessed with the transmission of a disjointed multitude of moral doctrines to be imposed insistently. Because referring to these doctrines as secondary aspects of the Christian life because they allegedly do not in themselves convey the heart of Christ's message, Francis has unintentionally conveyed the impression that he lacks an integral hermeneutics of life in Christ and morality. I remember when he said this, Janet Smith said, well, I've spent the last 25 years of my life talking about contraception and the morality of contraception. Or what's her name? Uh, Miller, I forget her. I don't know why I don't remember her first name. Anyway, so she's been involved with the pro-life cause. She's been in jail several times. She's
Yeah.
been, all this kind of business. There has to be a way of seeing the integral connection between this and the Christian life. They're not in that sense. In that sense, they can't just be secondary aspects of the Christian life. It's life in Christ. That's why what is it? The third part of the Catechism, life in Christ, is all about the moral life. The chief end of man. How do we see the chief end of man connected to the moral virtues, the theological virtues, the commandments, and all of that? So this is why the whole business about minimizing or ignoring the import of the Ten Commandments. I mean, the Catechism spends how many hundreds of paragraphs discussing the commandments? Yes. It's grounded in the moral and theological virtues. It's grounded in the chief end of man, which is to love God, and so on. But you have to be able to show that if you're engaged, as Janet Smith was for years, in discussing sexual ethics, in particular humani vitae, contraception, and
Monica Miller, yes.
Monica Miller,
I
you
was
know,
just about to say that, but I didn't
Monica
want to.
Miller.
I didn't want to interrupt you.
She's involved in pro-life, the integrity of the unborn child. And can we actually think that that's just, you know,
Well, and even it spills over across the theological spectrum because it spills over not just from the sexual domain or the pro-life domain, but also someone I admire greatly, Dorothy Day, fighting for the
yeah,
poor. She often said
sure.
the reason why she and Peter Morin did what they did because they considered it to be a moral mandate of the gospel to help the poor. Why do we
Right,
fight for social justice, economic
right,
justice, racial
right,
justice, fighting
right,
for the poor? Why do we do that? Because we have a specific mandate from Christ to do those things.
right. So that's one of the, again, that was when he says this in paragraph 34 of Evangelii Gaudium, you can't be obsessed with the transmission of a disjointed multitude of moral doctrines to be imposed insistently. There were people, some
Yeah.
people lost their minds. What is he talking about?
Yeah, I
What
mean,
is
I
he-
exactly what would Pope Francis if someone had walked up to him and said, I'm filthy rich and I have 5 Rolls Royces in my garage and I have all kinds of bank accounts all over the world and vacation homes around the world. And I've thought about maybe the poor and giving my stuff away, but this is the best I can do right now in my complex circumstances.
Right.
Pope Francis would never condone that. He would look at that person square in the eye and say, "No, no, 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 you can't do that."
Exactly. But what about what had a primary emphasis? I mean, I wrote a long article on Laudatio, Laudato Si, the encyclical
Yeah,
on
yeah, which I
on
like.
yeah. There are many things I wrote it, but I didn't begin. I didn't. The focus of my article was an integral ecology of man. You see, so I tried to link that encyclical with the writings of John Paul II and Benedict on an integral ecology, an ecology of man, and that you find that also in Laudato Si, and that is the culture, the moral life,
Yeah, yeah.
family, even the integrity of the human body and sexual difference and all that. But of course, that encyclical has been interpreted as a kind of a major document for, climate change and all that. I don't know I don't know what
Well,
climate change is, but the fact is that that receives more of a primary emphasis in Francis's teaching than all these other matters that we've just been talking about.
yeah, it does, and
And that's unfortunate.
it considers it to be a moral mandate for us to
And
take
he
care.
considers it to be a moral mandate. Exactly. As you say, isn't it a moral mandate to help the poor? Isn't it a moral mandate to
Yeah.
affirm the integrity of
Well,
unborn human
this
life?
gets to the essence of something. I mean, one of the key differences, it seems to me, between John Paul Benedict on the one hand and Pope Francis on the other is that John Paul and Benedict sort of understood that we are in a cultural crisis and therefore
Right.
wanted to hold up the clarity of Catholic truth to lift us out. In other words, to make Catholics look different, to make us act differently than the presiding culture, so that there is a specific weight of difference between us and the outside culture. That it is not okay for a Catholic to simply melt into Western consumerist, what I call cul-de-sac suburban culture, and to live those values no differently than your neighbors, whether it's in the sexual domain or in the justice domain or social justice domain. We just imbibe the virtues and vices of everybody else, and it seems to me that Pope Francis, despite some noteworthy exceptions, sort of blessed that and said, "Well, if that's the best you can do, go ahead living your little
Right.
suburban consumerist lives." Now, that's a little bit unfair to Pope Francis because he routinely criticized consumerism, but nevertheless, he undercuts what the bite that he wants to give to those issues by talking incessantly about there's no moral mandate really at all, except outside of your circumstances.
Right, right, right. So we already talked about briefly about ecumenism. I have a chapter on the one church, the many churches, because it seems to me he doesn't, it's confusing. Let's put it that way. Unity, ecclesial unity and diversity within the one church. That to me is the major question, because we try to avoid, I say, the dilemma of on the one hand, affirming that the church that Christ founded subsists in its own right alone in the Catholic Church, and then wrongly concluding that outside the visible boundary of the church, all you have is confusion and ecclesial wasteland. To me, that's just not the case. Uh, and all you have to do is, as I said earlier, and as I always would tell my students, just sit down and read. I'm not even saying read Calvin and Luther, but just read all the many theologians throughout the last more than 500 years of the since the Reformation that it's possible to learn something from. Um, on the other hand, we have to avoid thinking that because um, Lumen Gentium in paragraph 8, and also in the Unitatis Redintegratio affirms that there are elements of truth and sanctification outside the visible boundary of the church. This is an ecclesial context, that therefore the church now embraces ecclesial relativism, that there are many churches. So yes, those elements, as I said earlier, don't exist in an ecclesial vacuum. They're ecclesially embodied. But ecclesiology here, yes, I think you can refer to, let's say, the historic churches of the Reformation to be churches, but in an analogous sense, not in the same sense as the Catholic Church. So I always say, the question about ecclesial unity and diversity is not something that just arises as an appendix. If you wrote a book on
Right,
ecclesiology,
right.
it's at the heart of understanding, the nature of the church, understanding Catholicity. What does it mean that Vatican II, talks about, the 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 implication of Catholicity for these
Yeah.
churches.
I think it
And
isn't. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say that it's not either one or the other, I would
Right.
say.
It is an analogous relationship. Insofar as they have Catholic truth within them, they are, in a
That's
sense,
right.
participating in some mysterious way in the
Right.
fullness of the Catholic. For example, do I believe that those churches you find in the East scattered here and there that are Monophysite churches, do I think that they're utterly false and everyone in them is going to hell precisely because they're Monophysites? No, I
No,
don't. Because they have that falsehood notwithstanding, they have all these other elements of Catholicity within them,
that's right.
that you could point to and say, there's a lot there that we can touch base with.
Right, right, right. Yeah, so we have to get we, if we're going to talk about Catholicity proper with respect to these other churches with a small c, we have to avoid thinking of either or.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
not either or. The other thing is, as I said earlier, receptive ecumenism. It seems to me that the church provides a justification for thinking that you can learn that these other churches may have formulated things that are actually a gift to the Catholic Church. I don't want to repeat myself there, but that's all it seems to me in paragraph 17 of Unitatis Redintegratio. I then have a chapter, but to me, that Francis was confused about that because he made it seem sometimes as if unity was generated from diversity, from ecclesial diversity, as opposed to the idea that there's one church and then there are elements of truth and sanctification outside the visible boundaries of that one church. So, how are we to think about ecclesial unity and diversity within the context of the one church? He sometimes made it seem as if diversity, unity was generated from diversity, and that was the point of ecumenical conversation. So to me, that was also confusion. There's also a confusion which we've already briefly discussed, and that is the dialogue of religions and the question of truth. And dialogue for him, at least there, is not truth oriented. In Fratelli Tutti, it's truth oriented, but then it seems to me he just wrongly thinks about, and here's the crucial point. He doesn't understand that there are conflicting truth claims between these religions.
Right.
There are conflicting truth claims. And so you have to be able to engage in I mean, I remember Ratzinger saying, yes, you know, you have to recognize dialogue with these other religions that you can, and you bring the full truth of the Christian faith to bear in that discussion. But those are superficial, he says, because at some point you have to be able to say, why am I not a Buddhist, a Muslim? What are the reasons? And since of course he accepts the idea that there are these conflicting truth claims, that you have to be able to provide a justification. That's what I talk about in my book on Jesus Christ, Scandal of Particularity, Vatican II, a theology, Catholic theology of religions, justification and truth. You have to be able to provide a justification for your beliefs. I say well, when I had classes, I used to say to the students, if the central claims of Christianity are true, then Islam must be false. Islam must be false. You have these conflicting truth claims. You have to engage in a dialogical apologetics there, interreligious apologetics. What's his name? Paul Griffith. He once wrote a book called, recovering basically the idea of apologetics because it had been lost after the Second Vatican Council, not
Yeah.
because of the Second Vatican Council, but after the Second Vatican Council. And he argued for the principle noia, the necessity of interreligious apologetics, you see.
Yeah.
But that, of course, predicated on the assumption that there are conflicting truth claims there. You can see God has not left himself without witness, and so you may find you know truth and so on in the texts of these other religions, but and they're there because of general revelation, the grace of God. But
Yeah.
at the same time, you have to be able to recognize that there are these conflicting truth claims.
And that's an extremely important point because it seems to me that what Pope Francis and those who think like him in this matter of interreligious dialogue are really pointing towards is that the orthopraxis transcends orthodoxy. And
Right,
we have such a commonality amongst all the
right,
religions of the world,
right,
and there is a sense in which a lot of the religions of the world follow the natural law, whether they realize it
right,
or not, in the moral
right,
domain. And so I don't mean to diminish that. Even C.S. Lewis and his, he talks about the Tao of the
right,
moral law
right, right,
that goes
right,
everywhere. Okay, fine. Yeah, true. Nevertheless, there are also significant differences in the orthopraxis domain that happen because of differences in orthodoxy, and in inability to engage in a vigorous apologetic with other religions on the level of truth. The truth claims is eventually going to undermine the orthopraxis that they think binds us
right.
together, which it doesn't. I mean, look at it, forget interreligious, ecumenical relations. Ecumenical relationships, say with Anglicans or Methodists,
Right.
who now embrace LGBTQ, who now ordain lesbian ministers, who now, are
A lesbian Archbishop of Wales.
yes, condone abortion and all these sorts
Right,
of things. To say then that we have this unity on the level of orthopraxis is simply a lie. It's just empirically false.
right. There's in the Dialogue and Proclamation, which was a document from the what was it? From oh the interreligious, what is it? The Pontifical Council for either for Interreligious Dialogue or from the theologians that are all on this committee. Anyway, they say it calls for interreligious apologetics. It says an open and positive approach to other religious traditions cannot overlook the contradictions that may exist between them and Christian revelation. It must, where necessary, recognize that there is incompatibility between some fundamental elements of the Christian religion and some aspects of such traditions. And then I quote Ratzinger. Anyone, he says, anyone who sees in the religions of the world only reprehensible superstition is wrong, but also anyone who wants only to give a positive evaluation of all religions and who has suddenly forgotten the criticism of religions that have been burnt into our souls, not only by Feuerbach and Marx, but also by such great theologians as Barth and Bonhoeffer, is equally wrong.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and in fact, at the end, one of Benedict's last addresses to the Courier, Roman Courier, he says, yes, of course, Nostra Aetate is a good document, etc. But he says, but he also points out the weakness of the document by saying it overemphasizes the positive nature of the religions and doesn't bring out their weakness, etc. Um, and
Yeah.
that's again that's something that we lose sight of. Um,
Yeah, I mean it's no slam on Vatican II to point out that its documents do contain flaws here. There's not a
well, their
council in the history of
weaknesses.
the church.
You can't. No, these documents, they're not perfect,
No, they're
um,
not.
and so
They're not.
I
And its
don't think that.
historical context was that, Nostra Aetate, post World War II, the Holocaust, in that historical cultural
Right,
context, is trying to
exactly.
overcome the sort of scorched earth teaching, that, oh, these are just all demon infested falsehoods.
Right,
It's
right,
like, okay.
exactly. So
But then
that's all
they
good.
went too far the other way.
Well, all right. So here's where Benedict says, on the 50th anniversary of the opening of Vatican II regarding the reception of Nostra Aetate, he says, in the process of active reception of Nostra Aetate, a weakness in this otherwise extraordinary text has gradually emerged. It speaks of religion solely in a positive way, and it disregards the sick and distorted forms of religion, which, from the historical and theological viewpoints, are of far reaching importance. For this reason, the Christian faith from the outset adopted a critical stance toward religion, both internally and externally. So, I mean, I always say that's missed, that's lost. The Pontifical Council, um, for interreligious relations or dialogue, it produced a document a few years ago. It was a great document on truth and charity, the conditions for interreligious dialogue. But then it misses all that when it sends out, in my judgment, when it sends out these letters, on to religious, whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism or something, whatever it is. And then the implication or the suggestion is that these religions have some kind of salvific efficacy, as if
Yes.
somehow you're not calling them to event. I don't. They're not. You're not calling them to evangelization. I used to say in my archdiocese here, you can have people, interreligious relations, but there is no discussion. There's no sense of the conflicting claims. None of that. All of that is
Well,
empty.
and by the way, what's the point to dialogue if its endpoint isn't truth? That you're both seeking the truth. If you're not both
Exactly.
seeking the truth, if you're just wanting to be, as the Germans would call it, a feeling of being gemütlich,
Yeah,
that we're,
gemütlich.
yeah,
Yeah,
that we're
yeah.
just gemütlich, then what's the point to it?
Yeah, so all of that, I discuss all of that in this chapter on the dialogue of religion and the question of truth. I expanded on that in my book on Jesus Christ's scandal of particularity, because I focus in on the question of justification, the nature of truth. We're realists. As Catholics, we think that theological propositions are true because what they assert is in fact the case about objective reality. If you're not interested in truth, see, that's also a crucial difference between John Paul II and Benedict, and they emphasize the truth-oriented nature of dialogue. Um, and
Yeah,
then
absolutely.
at the end of the day, and my last chapter is called The Crisis of the Church. Um, I say in this concluding chapter, I develop a response to the current crisis of the church by arguing that this crisis is, as such, doctrinal, it's moral, and it's also ecclesial. In particular, regarding the latter, it pertains to the epistemological significance of the sensus fidelium and the corresponding notion of synodality in the light of the church. Therefore, in light of this crisis, Vatican II enjoins, quote, all Catholics are led to examine their own faithfulness to Christ's will for the church and accordingly to undertake with vigor the task of renewal and reform. The whole church, laity, and hierarchy together engages in this task, and it is more than ever needed now. In conclusion, I will say something about each of these aspects needing renewal and reform. Um, I
Well,
think there's confusion there. Um, the whole business of ressourcement and aggiornamento has been wrongly understood. Francis, I think, wrongly understands that. Um,
yeah.
Again, I come back to Vatican II and so on, but it just seems to me if I know the people, they're what's all these Francis supporters, they don't think that there's confusion in Francis. They think the confusion is in us, or
Yeah.
we don't know how to read Francis properly, or
Well, and that's why they so often engage in ad hominem, not all of them, but a few, who I won't mention their names, engage in ad hominem attacks. They don't deal with our arguments. They refer to me as simple, instead of dealing with the arguments I've put forward in my various arguments, or, in articles,
right, the articles, right.
theological arguments. They don't deal with them. It's called, well, he's just a curmudgeon. He's just a Francis hater. He just has this agenda, Well, deal with my arguments then. don't just
Exactly.
don't just call me names. Deal with my
Right.
arguments, okay? When I go after a Cardinal Hollerich or a Cardinal McElroy or a Father Martin, okay, I present reasons why I think they are wrong theologically to hold the positions that they hold. All right, does that make me a Francis hater and to be dismissed? No. And so yeah, I agree with you. They think that there's no crisis. To pretend to
There's
your
no crisis.
conclusion, there's no crisis.
There's no
There's nothing
crisis.
to see here. Nothing to see
Nothing to
here.
see
Move
here. You
along.
guys are just talking,
Yeah,
it's and you're right. They don't attend to my arguments. I remember saying to them in various places, well, did you read my Francis book? Or did you read my articles
right.
where I
No, we
no,
didn't.
no, no,
And
no.
they also ignore something very important. Those of us who became critical of Pope Francis, as we began our conversation today to point out, were initially supporters of Pope Francis,
Right, right,
bending over backwards to provide a proper.
right.
We have no desire to criticize the Pope. I don't wake up in the morning and say, "Oh well, let
No.
me figure out new ways." I mean, even someone like Taylor Marshall, began. If you go back to 2013, 24, if you see his podcast, right, he's doing the same thing. He's bending over backwards to put Francis in a hermeneutic of continuity. Even he only gradually came to the realization, wait a minute, there's something really wrong going on here that needs to be criticized.
Right. Yeah, I mean, anyway, it's I'm interested in seeing how Leo the 14th, the place that he takes there. Um,
Yeah.
I don't
So
know.
it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell.
Well, it is hard to tell, and I don't know what his position is. At least Francis talked about that at the beginning in several of his writings. In fact, remember that address, that interview he gave to the Jesuits. Uh, he talks about Vatican II. He talks about Vincent of Lorenz. I have no idea what Leo thinks about Vatican II.
No, he has said many, many good things so far. He hasn't done anything of any great consequence, and maybe that's a step forward in its own regard. He hasn't done the equivalent of the "Who am I to judge" on the airplane
No,
comment.
he hasn't.
And I think
Uh,
that's a positive.
right.
I think he's got more prudential wisdom than Pope Francis did.
I
He's
am
not.
waiting. No, go ahead. You finish
No,
your.
I'm just going to say he's not the provocateur. Francis
No,
had a
he.
Francis had a real provocateur element within him, which I kind of
Right.
admired. I wish it had been on the different way, but I kind
Right.
of admired the fact that Francis did have a certain chutzpah. He had a certain spunk about him and was very
Right.
willing to be a kind of lobber of Molotov cocktails into the ecclesial conversation. But Pope Leo does not seem to be that.
No, but I mean, I don't know where he will finally land. But I mean, like when I've read his things on ecumenism, it just seems to me, in that respect, just to be in the line of Francis, and even on interreligious relations.
Yeah, we'll
At
see.
this, we'll see. At this point, I'm not encouraged. And then, of course, taking photos. I said, "Oh, you can talk to Father Martin if you want, but do you have to take a photo with him?
Yeah.
Because this is just Father Martin will just use that.
Yep. Yep.
And the
I
Pope's
wasn't happy.
yeah, the Pope's with me. He's
And he met
y-
yesterday, apparently, with a
yeah, yeah.
photo
He
op.
met
Some
yesterday with
that nun, that sister so and so, who's pro-gay marriage, pro-abortion, the whole bit. Yeah.
no.
Um,
Anyway, I am one last thing. I am going to work. I have other things that I'm writing right now, but eventually, once that's all taken care of, these books that I'm working on at the moment, um, I am going to work on a third edition of my Pope Francis book,
oh, good.
because I wrote this in 2019. I mean, he didn't die until 2025. So
Yeah. Yeah.
obviously the most uh, his ecclesiology, synodality,
Yeah.
all
Fiducious
of that.
supplicans.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, and I want to try to integrate a discussion of Leo by that time.
Yeah.
But
I'm a little more hopeful about Pope Leo than I think you are.
yeah.
I kind of like the guy so
Well,
far.
his
So far.
his his attitude, of course, is different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the sermons that he's given are fine.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, it'll be really telling since he's from Chicago who he places in replacement for Cardinal Supich. That will tell us a lot.
yeah,
That
yeah,
will
that's
tell us.
true. Why Supers is gonna he's
Oh yeah, I imagine since Pope Leo is from Chicago that he will take a keen interest in who replaces Supich in Chicago. So
right.
that'll be a real canary in the coal mine right there.
Well, that's your point about how Francis's appointments were all
Oh yeah,
terrible.
it's bad. So we'll see. Anyway, we've gone like an hour and 40 minutes here. We should probably wrap
Okay,
this
we'll
up.
quit now. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm
Well,
glad we were able to talk about
I
my
am
post
too, and
various
great
aspects of
book. I hope
yeah.
everybody runs out and buys it.
You can
Great
get it
book,
on Amazon.
and I'm sure we'll talk again, Eduardo. So
Okay.
take
Good to
care.
talk to you. Take
Good
care,
talking to you.
Larry. Take
Okay,
care,
bye
brother.
bye.